Christianity teaches the strange doctrine that the Messiah, Jesus, had to die in order to atone for the sins of mankind. According to this doctrine, when Jesus died on the cross, he took on the sins of every human, including those humans who were yet to be born. Anyone who believes this has his sins washed away and is saved. Inversely, a person who does not believe Jesus died for their sins will appear on the day of judgment, still carrying his sins, and will be judged. But does this concept of one man taking on the sin of others have any biblical basis? We will explore Christianity's sin sacrifice theology in light of the Old Testament, and the life and teachings of Jesus. The Christian sin sacrifice theology is based on the premise that God does not forgive sins unless a sacrifice is made. Christianity tries to connect Jesus' atoning sin sacrifice to Old Testament animal sacrifices. But this argument holds no water. There is a world of difference between Old Testament animal sacrifices and the so-called sacrifice of Jesus. First, animal sacrifices in the Old Testament were carried out by Levite priests, and followed specific rules and rituals from the Torah. However, Jesus' so-called sacrifice followed none of the rituals prescribed in the Torah. Rather, it was carried out by Roman pagans in accordance with Roman execution procedures. Another key difference lies in the way the sacrifices were done. In the Old Testament, unblemished animals would be slaughtered and burnt whole on an altar dedicated to God. In contrast, Jesus was whipped, tortured, and then nailed to a cross, and was then left to die hanging. Interestingly, the Torah says a man who hangs is cursed of God. We read this in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. For a hanged man is cursed by God. If God said a man who hangs is cursed, it's ridiculous to think God wanted Jesus sacrificed specifically by hanging. The torturous crucifixion of Jesus on the cross was a Roman-style execution, not a sin sacrifice that would have been acceptable to God. Yet, Christians interpret this execution of Jesus as being a sacrifice that took away the sin of all mankind. While God accepted animal sacrifices, he considered human sacrifices as an abomination. We read this in several places in the Bible. Jeremiah 19 verse 5 tells us very unambiguously that God never even considered the idea of human sacrifice. If God was against human sacrifices, then it is absurd to imagine he would have accepted a sacrifice in which Jesus was whipped and nailed to a cross. The Old Testament makes it clear that one man cannot be punished for the sins of another man, let alone all of mankind. If this were possible, then there should have been a precedent in the Old Testament. But this is not the case. In Exodus 32, we read that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, the Israelites sinned greatly by worshipping an idol of gold. Moses requested God to forgive the Israelites, or punish him for their sins. But God denied Moses' request, and said he punishes only those who sinned against him. This alone should make it very clear that one man cannot be punished for the sins of another. This concept that only the sinner is punished is repeated elsewhere in the Old Testament. In Ezekiel 18, verse 20, God says, "The one who sins is the one who will die." In fact, the entire chapter is a lesson about people being held responsible for their own sins. Jeremiah 31, verse 30 repeats the idea that everyone is responsible for their own sins. Furthermore, God says that good people are saved by their own righteousness. We read in Ezekiel 14, verses 13 and 14, that while sinners are destroyed, righteous men are saved on account of their own righteousness. If the Old Testament tells us that every man bears the responsibility for his own sin, and is punished for it, then what gives Christians the idea that Jesus somehow bore their sins and took the punishment for it? The very idea is unbiblical and downright foolish. The only instance of sinners transferring their sins to another being appears in Leviticus 16. We read that the sins of the people would be transferred to a goat dedicated to an entity named Azazel. Once this was done, the goat would then be released into the wilderness. This passage is the origin of the term scapegoat. And Christianity, by teaching that Jesus took on their sins, reduces the Messiah to a scapegoat, similar to the scapegoat of Leviticus 16. We are told that Jesus' death was the perfect and final sacrifice. Yet, the prophet Ezekiel says that in the future, when the third temple has been built, animal sin sacrifices would be reinstated. Ezekiel, chapter 43, mentions detailed instructions concerning these sacrifices. Ezekiel writes of altars, unblemished animals, sin offerings, Levitical priests and sacrificial rituals. It reads like something from the book of Leviticus. This raises the question, if animal sacrifices for sin is to be reinstated in the future, then what was the point of Jesus' sin sacrifice? How can Jesus be the final and perfect sacrifice, as believed by Christians? Christians must either admit a major contradiction in the Bible, or admit that the idea of Jesus' sin sacrifice is unbiblical. Moving on to the New Testament, did Jesus ever teach that it was his mission to be sacrificed for the sins of mankind? Was Jesus even willing to be sacrificed for the sins of mankind? The answer is, no. And the proof is as follows. First, on several occasions, Jesus escaped from the Pharisees whenever they sought to kill him. This is mentioned in Matthew 12 verses 14 and 15 and John 8 verse 59 and John 10 verse 39. If Jesus was supposed to die for the sins of all mankind, he would not have escaped from the Pharisees. Rather, he would have simply allowed them to capture him and kill him. Second, Jesus prayed to God just before his capture, and asked for the cup to pass from him. This is mentioned in Matthew 26 verse 39. Jesus prayed saying, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." The cup has been interpreted to mean the mortal danger that was looming over Jesus. If Jesus was supposed to die for the sins of all mankind, he would not have prayed to be saved from death. Rather, he would have handed himself over to the Pharisees so they could have him killed. Third, at his trial before the Pharisees, Jesus defended himself and told the Pharisees to check with those who heard him. This account appears in John 18 verses 20 and 21. If Jesus was supposed to die for the sins of all mankind, he would not have defended himself before the Pharisees. Rather, he would have stayed silent and allowed the Pharisees to have him killed, and fulfill his mission, as per the supposed divine plan. Fourth, Jesus implied that a terrible fate awaited the one who was to betray him, that is, Judas. Jesus said it would have been better if Judas was not born at all. This is mentioned in Matthew 26 verse 24. So, if Jesus was supposed to die for the sins of all mankind, then Judas would not have had a terrible fate for betraying Jesus. Rather, Judas should be understood as the man who helped arrange for the great sacrifice of Jesus. The fact that Jesus warned of great punishment for Judas proves Jesus did not want to be captured and crucified. Fifth, after his resurrection, the risen Jesus does not say anything about his crucifixion being the sacrifice that removed the sin of all mankind. This is the case in all four Gospels. If Jesus really died for the sins of all mankind, he would not have remained silent about the purpose of his death. He would have told everyone about his sacrifice after his resurrection. In fact, throughout his life, and in all of his sayings, Jesus does not make a single unambiguous statement about him having to die in a sacrifice to take away mankind's sins. If Jesus was indeed supposed to die for the sins of all mankind, he would not have kept silent about it during his sermons. Rather, the theology of the sin sacrifice would have been his central teaching. Thus, we have seen that the things that Jesus did and said are not the actions of someone whose mission it was to be sacrificed for the sins of all mankind. Now, if I'm wrong, and if accepting Jesus' sacrifice indeed saves a person, then the implication would be that every Christian would be saved. However, the Bible tells us in Matthew 7 that in the afterlife, there would be many Christians who would go to Jesus calling him Lord and telling them of things they did in his name. But Jesus rejects them, saying, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers." How can this be, if believing in Jesus' sacrifice washes a person from sin? And if those Christians believed Jesus died for their sins, then why are they rejected as evildoers? Shouldn't they be washed of their sins, as Christian theology teaches? The obvious answer is that sin sacrifice theology is completely bogus. Every man is responsible for his own sins. And another man, not even the Messiah, can take on the sins of others.